I timed that live thing perfectly right, between my phone and the computer. So good timing on me. Anyways, sorry I didn't stream yesterday. I want to continue with this book, but it was a very busy day. We've been putting out so much content lately, as you might have seen. And yeah, that's going to continue. Tomorrow we have a showing of, this is not for Mint Press, but for Nevadans for Palestinian Human Rights. We have a showing of Abby Martin's Gaza Fights for Freedom at the local library. You can go to our Nevadans for Palestinian Human Rights social media channels to get the deets on that. I think there might still be time to RSVP. I don't think they've closed RSVPs, but I think they would have only done that if we had hit our capacity. So if you're around, check that out. We are going to pick up with Men in the Sun by Ghassan Kanafani tonight. I guess it's tonight for some of you and daytime for others, like myself. Iced coffee. So we finished up to this section called Sun in the Shade, which is on page 63. So we're going to finish, well, maybe we'll finish this section. How much of this book is left? There's only 118 pages on this book, so you know, we'll read a big old chunk. Hopefully, well, I had my page right there, and when I scrolled to the bottom, everything started loading again, so I have to scroll down and find it again and let everything load. Sometimes it does that. This is just a PDF I'm reading, so bear with me. Okay, here we go. Wow, now that's good. Okay, I can read this now. All right, so continuing where we left off. In just a moment. I have black iced coffee and water, so that's why I'm drinking two separate things. This section is called Sun and Shade. The lorry, a small world, black as night, made its way across the desert like a heavy drop of oil on a burning sheet of tin. The sun hung high above their heads, round, blazing, and blindingly bright. None of them bothered to dry their sweat any longer. Assad spread his shirt over his head, bent his legs, and let the sun roast him without resistance. Marwan leaned his head on Abu Qais's shoulder and closed his eyes. Abu Qais stared at the road, tightly closing his lips under his thick gray mustache. None of the four wanted to talk anymore, not only because they were exhausted by their efforts, but because each one was swallowed up in his own thoughts. The huge lorry was carrying them along the road, together with their dreams, their families, their hopes and ambitions, their misery and despair, their strength and weakness, their past and future, as if it were pushing against the immense door to a new, unknown destiny, and all eyes were fixed on the door's surface as though bound to it by invisible threads. We'll be able to send Kais to school and buy one or two olive shoots. Perhaps we'll build a cottage to live in, which will be ours. I'm an old man. I may survive. I may not. And do you think that the life you lead here is better than death? Why don't you try as we do? Why don't you get up off that cushion and set out through God's world in search of a living? Will you spend the whole of your life eating the flour ration for 1 kilo of which you sacrifice all your honor at the doors of officials? The lorry traveled on over the burning earth, its engine roaring remorselessly. Shafika is an innocent woman. She was an adolescent when a mortar bomb smashed her leg and the doctors amputated it from the top of the thigh. And her mother didn't like anyone to talk about his father. Sakario was gone. There, in Kuwait, you'll find everything out. You'll learn everything. You're still a boy, and you know no more of life than a babe in the arms knows of its house. School teaches nothing. It only teaches laziness. So leave it and plunge into the frying pan with the rest of humanity. The lorry traveled on over the burning earth, its engine roaring with an intolerable noise. Perhaps it was buried in the ground. The bomb he trod on as he was running, or maybe it was thrown in front of him by a man hidden in a nearby ditch. None of that is important now. His legs were suspended in the air, and his shoulders were still on the comfortable white bed, and the terrible pain was still plunging between his thighs. There was a woman there, helping the doctors. Whenever he remembered it, his face was suffused with shame. And what good did patriotism do you? You spend your life in an adventure, and now you are incapable of sleeping with a woman. And what good did you do? Let the dead bury their dead. I only want more money now. More money. The lorry traveled on over the burning earth, its engine roaring loudly. The policeman pushed him in front of the officer, who said to him, "You think you're a hero when the donkeys carry you on their shoulders, demonstrating in the street?" He spat in his face. But Assad didn't move as the saliva ran slowly down his forehead and gathered on the tip of his nose in a nasty, vicious mess. They led him out, and when he was in the corridor, he heard the policeman, who was grasping his shoulders, say in a low voice, "Damn this uniform." Then he let him go, and Assad ran off. His uncle, wishing to marry him off to his daughter, wanted him to make a start in life. Otherwise, he would never have collected 50 dinars in the whole of his life. The lorry traveled on over the burning earth, its roaring engine, a gigantic mouth devouring the road. The sun in the middle of the sky traced a broad dome of white flame over the desert, and a trail of dust reflected an almost blinding glare. They used to be told that someone wasn't coming back from Kuwait because he died. He'd been killed by sunstroke. He'd been driving his shovel into the earth when he fell onto one knee and then on both. And then what? He was killed by sunstroke. Do you want him buried here or there? That was all. Sunstroke. It was quite right. Who called it sunstroke? Wasn't he a genius? This desert was like a giant in hiding, flogging their heads with whips of fire and boiling pitch. But could the sun kill them, and all the stench imprisoned in their breasts? The thoughts seemed to run from one head to another, laden with the same suspicions, for their eyes suddenly met. Abu Karazan looked at Marwan and then at Abu Qais, whom he found staring at him. He tried to smile and failed, so he wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, murmuring, "This is the hell that I had heard of." God's hell? Yes. Abul Kharazan reached out his hand and turned off the engine, and then slowly got down, followed by Marwan and Abu Qais, while Assad remained perched above them. Abul Kharazan sat in the shade of the lorry and lit a cigarette. He said in a low voice, "Let's rest a little before we begin the performance again." Abu Qais asked, "Why didn't you set out with us yesterday evening so that we would be saved by the cool of the night from all this trouble?" Without raising his eyes from the ground, Abu Kharazan replied, "The road between Safwan and Matla is full of patrols at night. During the day, no patrol can run the risk of making a reconnaissance in heat like this." Marwan remarked, "If your lorry is so sacrosanct and is never searched, why can't we stay outside that terrible prison?" Abu Kharazan replied sharply, "Don't be silly. Are you afraid of spending 5 or 6 minutes inside? We've done more than half the journey, and only the easiest part is left." He stood up, went over to the water skin hanging outside the door, and opened it. "I'll put a splendid lunch for you when we arrive. I'll have 2 chickens killed." He raised the water skin, poured the water into his mouth until it began to trickle out the corners onto his chin and wet shirt. When he had quenched his thirst, he poured the rest of the contents over his head, letting the water run down over his forehead, neck, chin, chest, which gave him an extraordinary appearance. He hung the water bottle outside the door again, spread his big hands, and cried, "Come on, you've learned the art well. What time is it now?" "11:30. Think, in 7 minutes at the outside, I'll open the cover for you. Remember that. 11:30. Marwan looked at his watch and nodded. He tried to say something, but it was beyond him, so he took a few steps over to the iron ladder and began to climb it. Assad rolled up his shirt and plunged into the opening. Marwan hesitated a little and then followed him. Leaning with his stomach on the edge and then skillfully sliding down with a sharp movement, Abu Qais shook his head, saying, 7 minutes? At the outside. Abul Kharazan patted Abu Qais on the shoulder and looked straight into his eyes. They stood there together, streaming with sweat, neither of them able to speak. Abu Qais climbed the ladder with firm steps and let his legs down through the opening. The two younger men helped him down. Abul Kharazan closed the cover and turned the curved metal handle twice before jumping quickly down and rushing to his seat. Only a minute and a half later, he had driven his lorry through the big open gate and barbed wire fence around the post of Mutla. He brought it to a stop in front of the wide steps leading to the tiled, one-story building, flanked on both sides by small rooms with low, closed windows. Opposite it were a few stalls selling food, and the noise of air conditioners filled the air. There were only one or two cars parked waiting at the edge of the big square. The silence hung heavy and unbroken, except for the hum of the air conditioners attached to all the windows looking out onto the square. Only one soldier was standing in a small wooden hut beside the wide flight of steps. Abul Kharazan hurried up the steps and made for a third room on the right. Immediately, he opened the door and went in. He felt, from the glances directed at him by officials, that something was going to happen, but he didn't pause, pushing his papers in front of the fat official sitting in the center of the room. "Aha! Abul Kharazana!" shouted the official, and he slid the papers from one side with deliberate carelessness and crossed his arms on the metal desk. "Where have you been all this time?" Abul Kharazan panted. "In Basra. Haj Rida asked after you more than 6 times." The lorry had broken down. The 3 officials in the room broke into a loud laughter, and Abul Kharazan turned round at a loss. Then he fixed his eyes on the fat man's face. "What is it that amuses you this morning?" The 3 officials exchanged glances and burst out laughing again. Abul Kharazan said tensely, shuffling from one foot to the other, "Now, Abu Bakir, I've no time for jokes. Please." The official... Stretching out his hand, he moved the papers closer in front of the official. But again, Abu Bakir pushed them away to the edge of the desk, folded his arms, and smiled wickedly. "Haj Rida asked about you 6 times. I told you the lorry was not working, and Haj Rida and I come to an understanding when we met. Please sign the papers. I'm in a hurry." He slid the papers close again, but once more Abu Bakir pushed them away. "Your lorry wasn't working. Yes, please, I'm in a hurry." The officials looked at one another and quietly gave a knowing laugh. The desk of one of them was completely bare, except a small glass of tea. The others had stopped working to follow what was happening. The fat man called Abu Bakir, said, belching, "Now be sensible, Abu Kharazana. Why do you hurry your journey in terrible weather like this? The room here is cool, and I'll order you a glass of tea, so enjoy the comfort." Abul Kharazan picked up the papers, took the pen lying in front of Abu Bakir, and went around the table to stand beside him. He pushed the pen towards him, nudging his shoulder with his arm. "I'll spend an hour sitting with you when I come back, but now let me leave, for Bakir's sake and Bakir's mother's sake. Here." Abu Bakir, however, did not move his hand, but continued to stare stupidly at the driver, on the point of bursting out laughing again. "Ah, you devil, Abu Kharazan! Why don't you remember that you were in a hurry when you were in Basra, eh? I told you the lorry was in the garage." Again, he pushed the pen towards Abu Bakir, but he didn't move. "Don't lie, Abu Kharazan, don't lie. Haj Rida told us the story from A to Z." "What story?" They all exchanged glances. As Abul Kharazan's face turned white with terror, the pen began to tremble in his hand. "The story of that dancer. What's her name? Ali?" From the other side of the empty desk, Ali answered, "Kawakab. Kakab." Abu Bakir hit his desk with his hand and gave a broad smile. "Kakab, Kakab. Abu Kharazan, you devil, why don't you tell us what you get up to in Basra? You make make us out to us that you are a decent, well-behaved fellow, and then you go to Basra and commit mortal sins that the dancer Kakab, yes, Kakab, that's the name. What's all this rubbish about Kakab? Let me go before Hajrita gives me the sack. Abu Bakir replied, Impossible. Tell us about this dancer. The Hajj knows the whole story and he told it to us. Come on. If Hajrita's told it to you, why don't you want to tell it to me again? Abu Bakir stood up. Why do you want me to tell it to you again? Abu Bakir stood up and gave a bull-like roar. Ah, so it's true. It's a true story. He walked around the desk and came to the middle of the room. The story of the depravity had excited him. He had thought about it day and night, endowing it with all the obscenity created by his long tormenting deprivation. The idea that a friend of his had slept with a prostitute was exciting and worth all those dreams. You go to Basra and make out that the lorry isn't working, and then you spend the happiest night of your life with Kakab. Good heavens, Abu Karazana, good heavens, you devil. But tell us how she has shown her love for you. Hajrita says that she loves you so much that she spends her money on you and gives you the checks. Ah, Abu Karazana, you devil. He came up to Abu Karazan, his face red. Obviously, he'd enjoyed himself thinking about the story as Hajrita had told it to him over the telephone. He leaned over and whispered hoarsely in his ear, Is it your virility, or aren't there many men about? Abu Karazan laughed hysterically and shoved the papers at Abu Bakir's chest. He picked up the pen and began signing them automatically, shaking with suppressed laughter. But when Abu Karazan stretched out his hand to take them, Abu Bakir hid them behind his back, warding off Abu Karazan with his other arm. Next time, I'll go with you to Basra. Agreed? You'll introduce me to this Kakab. Hajrita says she's really beautiful. Abu Karazana said in a trembling voice as he stretched out his arm, trying to reach the papers. I agree. On your honor? On my honor. Abu Bakir collapsed into a renewed laughter, shaking his round head as he went back to his desk, while Abu Karazan rushed outside with his papers, pursued by Abu Bakir's voice. You devil, Abu Karazana. You deceived us for 2 years, but now he's shown up. Ah, you devil, Abu Karazana. Abu Karazan burst into the other room, looking at his watch, 11:45. The signing of the papers didn't take more than a minute. When he shut the door after him, the heat lashed him again, but he took no notice, jumping down the wide steps 2 at a time until he stood in front of his lorry. He looked at the tank for a moment, and he had the impression that the metal was about to melt under that fearful sun. The engine responded to the first touch, and he instantly closed the door, not waving to the guard. The road now was completely level, and he had a minute or a minute and a half before he could round the first bend behind him from the post. He was forced to slow down a little when he met a large lorry, but then he put his foot down till the vehicle was going at top speed. When he reached the bend, the wheels set to a screech like a howl and almost touched the sand verge as they made their enormous turn. There was nothing in his mind but terror. He thought he would collapse over the steering wheel in a faint. The wheel was hot and he felt it scorch his hard hands, but he didn't slacken his hold on it. The leather seat burned under him. The glass windscreen was dusty and blazed with sun's glare. A loud hiss came from the wheels as though they were flaying the asphalt. Did you have to talk so much rubbish, Abu Bakir? Did you have to spew all your filth onto my face and theirs? The curse of Almighty God be upon you. The curse of Almighty God, who doesn't exist anywhere, be visited upon you, Abu Bakir, and on you, Hajrita, you liar, a dancer, a Kakab? God damn you all. He stopped the lorry sharply and climbed over the wheel to the roof of the tank. When his hands touched the metal roof, he felt them burn, and he couldn't keep them there. He moved them away and leaned his elbows in their sleeves on the metal roof, crawling on the angular lock. He took hold of it with the corner of his blue shirt and turned it so that it burst open and the rusty metal disc stood vertical over its hinges. As he let go of the disc, he caught sight of the heads of the watch on his wrist. He pointed to 9 minutes to 12. The round glass had cracked into little pieces. The uncovered opening yawned empty for a moment. Abu Karzan's face, drawn to it, twitched compulsively, his lower lip trembling as he panted for breath, overcome with terror. A drop of sweat from his forehead fell onto the metal roof of the tank and immediately dried. He put his hands on his knees and bent his soaked back until his face was over the black hole and shouted in a dry, grating voice, "Assad!" The sound reverberated in the tank and almost pierced his eardrums as it came back to him. Before the echo of the rumble that his first cry had set up had dried away, he shouted again, "Hey there!" He put two firm hands on the edge of the opening and, supporting himself on his strong arms, slid down inside the tank. It was very dark there, and at first he couldn't make out anything. But when he moved his body away from the opening, a circle of yellow light fell into the depths and showed a chest covered with thick gray hair that began to shine brightly as though coated with tin. Abul Karzan bent to put his ear to the damp gray hair. The body was cold and still. Stretching out his hand, he felt his way to the back of the tank. The other body was still holding onto the metal support. He tried to find the head, but could only feel the wet shoulders. Then he made out the head, bowed on the chest. When his hand touched the face, it fell onto an open mouth as wide as it could go. Abul Karzan had a choking sensation. His body had begun to run with sweat and at such an amazing rate that he felt he was coated in thick oil. And he couldn't tell whether he was trembling because of this oil covering his chest and back or whether it was caused by fear. Bending down, he felt his way to the opening, and then when he put his head through it, Marwan's face came into his mind for some reason and wouldn't go away. He felt his face take possession of him from within, like a fresco shimmering on a wall. So he had started to shake his head violently as he slipped down from the opening, and the merciless sun burned it. He turned for a moment, breathing in the fresh air. He couldn't think of anything. Marwan's face had surged up to take complete possession of his mind, like a spring that bursts from the earth and sends its water high into the air. When he reached his seat, he remembered Abu Qais, whose shirt was still lying in the seat beside him. He took it in his long fingers and threw it far away. He switched on the lorry's motor and it began to roar again as the lorry made its slow, majestic way down the slope. He turned around to look through the small netted window and saw the round disc open, standing straight over its hinge with the inside corroded with rust. Suddenly the metal disc disappeared behind drops of salt water which filled his eyes. He had a headache and vertigo such as he had never felt before. Were those salty drops tears or sweat running from his burning forehead? Wow. I think they just died because they were in the water container too long. This next section is called The Grave. As darkness fell, Abu Karzan drove his lorry away from the sleeping city. Pale lights trembled along the side of the road, and he knew that those lampposts that were retreating in front of the window would come to an end shortly. When he had left the city far behind him, the darkness would be unbroken. The night was moonless, and the edge of the desert would be as silent as the grave. He turned his lorry off the asphalt road and drove along the sandy track that led into the desert. He had made up his mind at noon to bury them, one by one, in 3 graves. Now, he felt consumed with exhaustion as though a drug had been injected into his arms. He had no strength to work. He wouldn't be capable of wielding a spade for long hours to dig 3 graves. Before he went to take his lorry out of Haj Rita's garage, he told himself that he wouldn't bury them. He would throw the 3 corpses into the desert and return home. But now he wasn't pleased with the idea. He didn't like to think that his companions' bodies should be lost in the desert, at the mercy of the birds and the beasts of prey, and that there would be nothing left of them after the few days except white bones lying on the sand. The lorry moved over the sandy track with a muted noise. While he went on thinking, he wasn't thinking in the strict sense of the term, but a series of disconnected scenes was passing ceaselessly through his brain, incoherent and inexplicable. He could sense exhaustion creeping through his limbs like a straight column of ants. The breeze sprang up and carried to his nostrils a smell of putrefaction. He said to himself, "The municipality piles up the rubbish here." Then he reflected, "If I dumped the bodies here, they would be discovered in the morning and buried under official auspices." He turned his steering wheel and followed the tracks of many wheels that dug their path through the sand before him, and then he switched off the headlamps, advancing slowly by the light of the side lamps alone. When the black heaps of rubbish rose up in front of him, he switched off the side lamps. The air around him filled with putrid stench, and he soon got used to it. Then he stopped his lorry and climbed down. Abul Kharazan stood beside his lorry for a few moments to make sure that no one was watching him. Then he climbed onto the back of the tank. It was cold and damp. He turned the curved metal handle slowly and pulled the iron disc up so that it burst open with a sharp explosion. Supporting himself on his arms, he slid slightly down inside. The first corpse was cold and firm, and he tossed it over his shoulder. He pushed his head out of the opening first, and then, holding the corpse by its leg, lifted it and threw it upwards. Hearing the heavy sound it made as it slid over the edge of the tank and the muffled bump as it struck the sand, he had great difficulty in pressing the hands of the other corpse away from the iron support. But then he pulled it by its legs to the opening and threw it over his shoulder. Straight and stiff, he heard it strike the earth. The third corpse was easier than either of its companions. He jumped down, slowly closed the opening, and climbed down the ladder to the ground. There was a thick darkness everywhere, and he was relieved that he would be saved by it from seeing the faces. Holding them by their feet, he dragged the corpses one by one and threw them onto the end of the road, where the municipality's dust carts usually stopped to dump their rubbish, so that the first driver arriving in the morning would easily have an opportunity to see them. He climbed into his seat, turned the engine on, and slowly reversed, trying his utmost to mingle the tracks of his lorry's wheels with those of others. He had decided to drive back to the main road in reverse in order to confuse the traces completely, but the thought occurred to him that when he covered some distance and he switched off the engine again, walked back to where he had left the bodies and took the money from their pockets. He also removed Marwan's watch. Then he retraced his steps to the lorry, walking on the edge of his soles. As he returned to the lorry and lifted one leg up, a sudden thought flashed into his mind. He stood rigid in his place, trying to do or say something. He thought of shouting, but immediately realized what a stupid idea that was. He tried to finish climbing onto the lorry, but he didn't feel strong enough. He thought that his head would explode. All the exhaustion which he felt suddenly rose to his head and began to hum in it. And so he put his head in his hands and began to pull his hair to expel the thought. But it was still there, huge and resounding, unshakable and inescapable. He turned to look back to where he had left the corpses, but he could see nothing, and the glance simply set the thought ablaze so that it began to burn in his mind. All at once, he could no longer keep it within his head, and he dropped to his hands to his sides and stared into the darkness with his eyes wide open. The thought slipped from his mind and ran onto his tongue. Why didn't they just knock on the sides of the tank? He turned right round once, but he was afraid he would fall, so he climbed onto his seat and leaned his head on the wheel. Why didn't you knock on the sides of the tank? Why didn't you say anything? Why? The desert suddenly began to send back the echo. Why didn't you knock on the side of the tank? Why didn't you bang on the sides of the tank? Why? Why? I think that's it. I think that's the end of the book. This next book, which is in the same PDF document, is called The Land of Sad Oranges. But that was it for The Men in the Sun, and that was a really tragic ending. And I was kind of afraid that was going to happen. Like the entire time I was reading this, I was afraid that this was going to be how that ended. And it seems like that was the case. And that was, yeah, that was horrible, and probably a story countless people have experienced something similar to as a result of the colonization of Palestine. So it's been a half hour. I'm going to leave y'all with that. We'll probably pick up this next book, which is, as I said, in the same PDF. It's called The Land of Sad Oranges. We'll pick that up on Monday in all likelihood. I hope you got something from this really fucking sad book. And power to the people, free Palestine.